Greetings and salutations. You are listening to the Into the North podcast, where we take a look at the competitive side of the Commander format, also known as cEDH. I am one of your hosts, Lyndon, aka Noobzors, and today I am joined by my co-hosts, Matt, aka Null.
Hey.
Reed, aka Sick Robot.
Howdy doody.
And Morgan, aka Spleenface.
What's up?
And in this episode, we will be covering evaluation of meta technology. So that's going to be card tech choices, teching against metas, and all that jazz. So, without further ado, we're going to try to make this episode expedient. Let's just jump right into new developments. So, what has happened since the last episode? Morgan, do you want to start?
Sure. We've actually had it's been a reasonably eventful 2 weeks.
A bunch, yeah.
First up, we have West Coast Commander, which is a new competitively focused EDH gameplay channel with some big names attached to it, like Wedge, who, if you know him from Discord or...
Wedge, not of the Mana Source.
Not
Wedge.
of the Mana Source, but he's had a hand in some big decks like Kess Consultation and Razakats, and ASM, and they're starting up with some pretty sweet gameplay vids, so go and check them out. We'll make sure to link
you might
them.
You might also know Wedge and ASM from
the Birthing
Pod podcast, which is basically where we got the entire idea to do this, and is like the original cEDH podcast. I guess along with like Fossils podcast, but
indefinite hiatus.
Indefinite hiatus, but they're back. They're back doing more content, so. If you haven't listened to the Birthing Pod podcast, you guys should go do that because it still holds up and it's still great.
Yeah,
Content's
same also
dated,
with Fossils podcast
fine.
Too. That's
some and then
good
Fossils
stuff
podcast. But yeah, so if you guys had listened to them before and want more of that content, go check West Coast Commander out because it's sick. And even if you hadn't, check them out.
And next up, Morgan, you want to cover this one as well?
Sure, yeah. So we had the DDM tournament last weekend. So that was a big charity tournament in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, and it sounds like they had huge turnout. I think it was more than 60 people entered, and they had some big names like Shaper and Scotty Knows MTG there as special guests, and sounds like it went super well, and they had some pretty interesting decks in the top 4, including a Heliod list, which is pretty spicy.
Let's just list the enther top 4, because it was a very spicy top 4.
Very spicy top 4.
There was Heliod, Yisan, Una, and Tatyova.
And Tatyova was the eventual winner, yeah.
Yeah. Very, very interesting results. And you can check out the tournament breakdown and retrospectives on that on the subreddit, the cEDH subreddit.
I believe, anyway. Yeah, there should be one, right? Yes.
Yeah, there's a few different posts of it.
Yeah. Because I know the Heliod guy did a breakdown of his tournament experience. I think there's also one for the
Tatyova report published the day that we're recording this.
Yep.
Yeah. So that was interesting. I'd definitely suggest reading those to get the perspective from people who came on top of this tournament with some really, really unique brews. And next up, Reed, you can cover this one.
Sure. Yeah. So big release this week.
this
like a day ago.
it's hard to say in like relative terms. Big release recently, before we recorded this episode. New resource /website /Discord, big thing, went public. It's called the Deck Forge. It is helmed by Shaper, because who else would helm a huge project like this? And then it's got a bunch of people helping out, making it work, making it function. But it's basically just it's looking to evolve into, and it's starting off as a resource to house the higher echelons of EDH power levels and the brewing for that kind of stuff, specifically. So just like making sure that there's a dedicated place for, like new commanders to be brewed with and people to like talk out ideas for new decks and all that kind of stuff. And then eventually, a bit down the road, there will also be a full website resource for helping to brew higher power level decks. I think we're going to have like full lists of full lists and categorizations of like different cards, I believe. Is how it's going to work out.
Different card types. There'll be lists, and there'll be they'll have all the information about the card, and then also certain tags to help find like if you're looking for, say, acceleration, they'll be tagged by type, but also like how much they net you, and some other useful information like how popular they are.
Yeah.
I just want to highlight some specific wording. Just giving deck help across the high power to max power spectrum. The aim is cordial, cooperative environment to engineer wild ideas and optimize builds. So it's like really open to not just our community, I think, to kind of anyone who's interested in optimizing.
Yeah, it's just like it's really just a resource for anybody that wants to look into like just like building like the general deck building strategies that happen at like the like top-ish power levels of any format, right?
It's also going to be very useful for people who aren't like wizards on Scryfall, or who don't have massive card knowledge.
People who are just like looking to maybe just like up their game a bit in casual metas, or maybe they're the power level of their local groups are ramping up a bit and they want a bit of help, or they just want to check out a resource. It's looking to be a bit more useful for that than EDH rec, or like more like general resources.
And if you've ever posted an optimization thread on the cEDH subreddit and been told that your deck was too casual and you should go to r/EDH, this might be the resource for you.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, and last but not least, we have the metagame project. Morgan, you're the most familiar with this, I think?
Sure, yeah. So Squirrel Mob has started a data collection form where after a game, you go and report, and he has some of the most popular meta decks listed, or you can just list your deck as something off meta, and you put in turn order, the decks people were on, and who won. And he's using that to do some analysis overall. So we just had the first week worth of data released. It had some interesting conclusions. Sushi Hulk is everywhere. It has a very disproportionate win rate. Now, obviously, we have, I believe the first set had about 150 games in, so, it's hard to be too certain, particularly with how broad a pool this data would be pulling from. And also going first, apparently, is a big deal.
Who would have thunk it?
It'll be interesting as we get more data.
I think that going first is definitely a good, quite the advantage, but I didn't expect it to be this wild.
Yeah, I think it's also something like 40% win rate.
It's 40.37% win rate over 161 games for a player in the first seat, which is like sort of ridiculous.
Yeah. So I think drawing strong conclusions from the first week is probably not the greatest idea, but I'm interested both. When we get more data, a few things will happen. First, we can draw stronger conclusions about the stuff we're already seeing. Yes. But also, when we have enough, we could potentially start slicing things, along multiple axes as well. Like one of the questions I was interested in, because one of the other things you report is game length, how many turns it lasted. One of the other things I was interested in is, are these turn or first player wins? Is that advantage mostly just in short games, or does it actually persist? If your game ends on turn 9, does it matter who went first, or is it only, they untap on turn 3 and everyone else was greedy and tapped out on turn 2 and then they won, kind of deal? So, it'll be interesting.
I'd also be interested to see, based off that kind of short game idea and like quick wins, whether or not, Sushi Hulk going first gets a much bigger advantage than other decks. Because
relative advantage is definitely something that I want to look into if we ever end up with enough data on this, because it's something that it's really hard to analyze, even like subjectively, like even playing a deck. So I'd like to see like some amount of actual real data on that and see if like there are some decks that benefit from certain seedings more than others.
Right on. Okay, so main topic, and that is meta technology. So the best place to start is with a definition. So Matt, I think you have a definition you wanna read out for us for what is
Yes.
tech exactly.
This is coming right off of mtg.gamepedia.com. So, everyone's favorite source of magic.
For everything, right?
Infos. Yeah. But this is actually a good description. So, a previously undiscovered improvement to an existing strategy, deck, or archetype, a card, or use of a card, which is an improvement on deck building technology and the current metagame. That's just the first sentence. There is more to it, but
Yeah,
I think that's a good description.
That's pretty good. I think there's some important things that we can highlight. So there's the undiscovered aspect,
I think
and then there's this specific metagame aspect as well.
I think the last sentence of this definition is also a good one, which is tech cards are frequently advantageous in specific scenarios and are thus included in response to expectations of the metagame.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's really good, especially as it pertains to the portion about specific metas, because not all tech and the way people use the word tech is about undiscovered cards and strategies and things like that. A lot of the time you'll hear people say, I'm just going to tech my deck against the meta, and they're not saying I'm going to go through Scryfall and search through a million different cards until I find one that no one's ever seen before and bust the meta wide open.
It's not even to necessarily improve matchups. It's just I'm just gonna find unknown cards to put in my deck against this meta.
Yeah, no, a lot of the times it is using known cards and known answers, but it's just the way that people talk about it in terms of combating the meta with specific card choices.
Yeah.
So
And I would like to say more than combating like the meta, specifically like combating a meta, right? Like a lot of the time, like technology will be you're targeting a specific meta that you have in mind.
So we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves here. So let's more precisely pin down what motivates tech, because we're kind of already jumping into this. So let's just kind of lay it out more formally. Reed,
Yeah,
do you
sure.
want to just carry on?
Yeah. So like basically, like tech is sort of motivated by realizing that there are cards in your deck that, while they might be good in like a base list, like certain types of removals, certain pieces of interaction, that kind of stuff, you realize over time, or like do an analysis and realize that you don't like them, or that they are suboptimal in a given metagame. You're playing against a lot of decks where this interaction isn't particularly useful, or you're not getting a lot of use out of this card, and you are just looking for cards to slot in those spaces that just like make more sense against the decks that you're playing against, or you anticipate you're going to be playing against. Some
cards are absurdly weak against particular strategies, right? Like maybe a Jund player in Modern might not want to, be running all of these Dark Confidants if they're just running into burn all the time, and the life loss can really add up.
Yeah.
Or something like that. I don't play that. I don't play Modern, so maybe Dark Confidant is secretly amazing, but who knows?
Maybe don't play Blue Blast and Commander.
Or like you're playing like a blue-white control deck, and Tron's carning you and urgating you every game, and you have like a deck full of like fourth Supreme Verdicts, and you're just like, well, these aren't doing anything. I should probably switch these out for something,
clear.
right? Yeah.
But I think there's also
don't play creatureless Elsha if everyone's on Timna.
There's also the opportunity, like that's sort of teching cards out of your deck, but there is also the opportunity to tech cards in, where you have something that's fine against all metas. Like it's just this card's okay. And it's not particularly weak, but you go, okay, this card that isn't normally in the list is very strong in my meta, so I'm going to take out just kind of a generic, maybe it's like the weakest counterspell in your deck, or the weakest cantrip or something like that, to put in a card that you think will be extremely effective in combating whatever it is that you see. Like,
if you want to keep the Modern analogies going, you can look at things like Obstinate Baloth versus Nullhide Ferox, in terms of, Nullhide Ferox is better against something like Jund, than Obstinate Baloth, whereas Obstinate Baloth much better against things like Burn, while still being good against Jund. So if you're teching really specifically for Jund, because you're at your LGS and for whatever reason all these people are running around with their $1,500 Jund decks, maybe you're going to run your Nullhide Feroxes on the side. But if you're worried about Burn, you're going to go with something like Obstinate Baloth, whereas these are cards that could be seeing play in your sideboard anyway, and you're not really taking out anything specifically because it's bad in your meta, like Morgan was saying, but just to kind of be a silver bullet for this kind of matchup.
Yeah. And I would like to say actually that like the stuff that we're talking about here in the context of like 1v1 formats tends to be in the sideboard. Meta technology typically tends to show up in the sideboard in 1v1 formats because you have the two other games, or theoretically two other games, at least one other game to put that into effect, and you can sort of afford to play a generalist main deck. When we talk about meta tech or meta technology, meta tech, whatever tech, in the context of EDH, it's really more about like tuning a main deck to combat a perceived meta. Because again, no sideboards, usually best of one games and matches.
Usually that means that like it's useful outside of its kind of intended tech situation.
Yeah,
it has some additional either whatever mode, or it can be used for value, even if it's weak. Like the fact that it's present in your deck means that you do have this possible blowout.
By the way, take a shot every time we say tech or meta in this episode.
We take no legal responsibility.
No, don't do that, because we still want to have an audience when we're done with this episode.
Yeah. Eat a piece of spicy salmon sushi if we say Hulk.
Oh God. Well, that's one.
Alcohol poisoning.
Yeah. But yeah,
so I think that pretty much covers what motivates tech.
Yeah, it's really
right?
like
in the
one of two things.
Sense,
it's either like there's a card, and it's the same thing that like motivates you to sideboard cards out and in 1v1 formats, which is sort of what I was trying to get to, is like it's either the card in your deck is bad in this matchup and you just need something to fill the space, and you reach for something to fill in that space, or there's something that you could add that you really want to add and you just need to take something out to put that card in.
Yeah. So what makes a good piece of tech? Because if you're trying to tech against in 1v1 against Burn, there's all kinds of different life cards you could put in your life gain cards you could put in your sideboard. You could put in the 1 mana white gain 3 life. It's like,
did you just forget the name of Healing Salve? My good sir.
I was gonna say Healing Salve, but I wasn't confident.
That is part of the boon cycle. Have one of the most OP on average cycles of cards ever printed.
Why'd you have to call me out, man? See, I was gonna say Healing Salve, but I figured it would look more embarrassing if I got it wrong. But I guess now I've got egg on my face. But whatever. That aside, gaining 3 life is not necessarily gonna be the best card to tech in that kind of matchup. Whereas something like a Kitchen Finks that gains 2 life on ETB and it's 2 bodies for blockers. Guys. Yeah.
Well, so like I think a better example would be like Healing Salve is just not a good card. But if you look at something like Life Goes On, which is you gain 4 life. If a creature died this turn, you gain 8 life instead, instant for a single green mana. Like gaining 8 life for 1 mana is very efficient in Modern against Burn, but only against Burn, right? So Kitchen Finks, as an example, it doesn't gain you as much life, but there are other matchups where you would also conceivably want it.
I'll have you know that Life Goes On is a Modern playable card. Okay. Staple as a one-of in the Neo Branch deck.
Okay. And immediately off track. Got there. Yeah, but like, so as Morgan was getting at, one of the good qualities for when you're looking at introducing meta tech into a deck is a card that's like generally good at combating a variety of situations or opposing decks, right? You don't want a card that's like fine at like combating something, but it can only combat the one thing, right? Mm-hmm. You one of the things that you're looking for is a card that has wide applicability and is like fairly good against all those things. And while it might be bad against things that aren't in the meta, you're looking for cards that are applicable against like as many things in the meta that you're looking at as possible. So to
Leyline of the Void against both Storm in terms of stopping their Past and Flame stuff, and then also good against Dredge, that kind of thing. So the more axes you can, or the more decks, you can. That's only attacking on a single axis.
But and to put it into context of like EDH and cEDH, cards like this would be like historically like rule of law effects or something like this as like a defensive option. Nowadays, something like a Grafdigger's Cage is really nice in this role because it hits Hulk decks. Sorry, that's a shot. Hits Kess decks. It hits like green decks that actually want to like be pulling stuff out of like creatures out of their deck consistently with like to board tutors, that kind of stuff. Hits like Divergent Polymorph.
Okay, yeah. So we're starting off jumping in right into perhaps the best tech piece in all of cEDH.
Well, yes. Yes.
Yeah. So the reason why, sorry for talking about 1v1 so much and giving up all these examples, but I think it's important to understand that the 1v1 examples are the very easy base case for these kind of 1v1 matchups, whereas in cEDH and EDH generally, you're facing 3 players and, the very wide meta. And so knowing what you're going to face is challenging, and trying to balance your tech choices to make sure that they're not just silver bolts against one deck, or maybe you should be silver bolt against one deck because it's a poor matchup. There's all kinds of complicated factors that go into cEDH, so we just figured we'd start off nice and simple with the
especially because in cEDH, teching is like in Modern, for example, you will often see sort of more silver bullet tech where it's like this card just destroys a matchup. But because in cEDH you don't have a sideboard, you have to put that card in your main deck or you're not running it. So it's a bigger commitment, which is why you generally want to look for more broadly applicable stuff.
Yeah. And also
that you don't just have a dead card in your deck, half the time.
Yeah, and also just generally because you're in a pod with 3 other players instead of 1 other player, so like focusing on hating one strategy is on average just like less valuable than it would be in a 1v1 format.
What are you talking about? Extract is a staple.
As well as the fact that when you're talking about cEDH, even though like decks are very refined and everything's very powerful, strategies in general tend to be less focused. There's a lot of homogeneity and a lot of how like certain how a lot of top level strategies function at their base, at their core. So it's harder to it's sort of harder to like shut like something down specifically. Like
silver bullets don't exist to the same degree where the whole deck just doesn't function because you have a card in play.
There's a wider variety of things happening.
Although at the same time, there by nature of being a multiplayer format, if you take a look, if you're being more abstract in how you look at win cons and core deck strategies and synergies, there are some trends that are fairly consistent among all cEDH decks that you don't see among all modern decks, right? The difference between Oko Urza deck before Oko got banned and a burn deck, very, very different. Whereas a food chain deck and a Gitrog monster deck, they're different for sure, but almost all decks in cEDH are trying to go infinite in some capacity. Now with Consult, that's the one sort of archetype that's sitting in its own little area, playing in a little sandbox on its own, not going infinite to win the game. But that's why rule of law, as Reed brought up earlier, is so strong as a generic kind of hate piece in cEDH, or at least it was for a long time. It's because, casting multiple spells in a turn is something that almost all cEDH decks were doing. And
even getting away, I'll get into this a bit. We can cover this a bit later. But also, not just hate pieces, but also things like, say, compost is an example of this. Where while it's not like great, generally, I'd say in like the general cEDH meta, if you're expecting the black decks for it, and like that's a fairly wide range of like strategies and decks, right? Like that's also a good idea, and it's not like a stacks piece. It's just something that puts you further ahead, and you can make that call if you are expecting to see enough.
Yeah, tech isn't just about interaction. Like you can, like in the case of compost, tech can be like a value engine.
Yeah, or even like different types of combos, or like sort of like swapping out combo pieces, or even just like going harder into combo pieces.
Yeah, well, in terms of
Yes.
compost, certainly is a tech option when you're saying something like, oh, it's not going to directly win you the game or stop your opponent from winning the game. Well, with Rhystic Study, Remora, and all these massive draw effects, when your opponents are casting spells, it's a well-known fact that the more you're allowing your opponents to draw from these, the higher their win percentages get. I mean, it's not that hard to figure out why, right? You let them resolve an ad nauseum to get 30 cards into their hand. You've just got all these options.
No, never.
Doesn't matter if you're doing it all at once or across 2 turns because you're hammering out all these spells. You're going to give them a massive advantage. So things like compost, while they're not as generally applicable as Remora and Rhystic Study, if you get them to be completely turned on from your opponent's casting black spells, demonic tutors, vampiric tutors all the time, then you are going to be very far ahead.
Compost and playing against the Gitrog monster, name a more iconic duo.
Dude, at one point,
Facts.
Remora was a tech option.
Was it?
There was one point where some guy brought Remora some person brought Remora to their playgroup, and they're like, "Oh my gosh,
Yeah,
Guys.
it's all bad now."
I miss those days.
Well, but like I think another card that now is certainly considered a staple, but might not actually be a staple in all metas at all times, is the equally powerful 1 mana enchantment Carpet of Flowers. Right? Like we're assuming that you'll have islands, and like even if it generates 1 mana a turn, that's typically good enough. But like sometimes you can't actually count on your opponents having islands in play. In certain metas, like I've talked to a few people who went like, there's one other blue player and they're playing, a budget mana base, so they don't have fetches. They're just playing a bunch of like rainbow lands and various different dual lands. A lot of games there's not an island in play, and then I play it, and then there's definitely not going to be an island in play. So, like, it is conceivable that you do actually cut carpet if you don't find the islands that you need to see.
So I think it might be useful because we're touching on all these different types of tech. Let's try to get some definitive categories.
Yeah.
So we've got like Silver Bullet hate, where you're trying to hate on a particular strategy that they're using to win the game.
And Silver Bullet in this context meaning a card that is very targeted, like very precise hate for a specific strategy that does not exactly have applicability outside of that use, right? You're just looking at shutting down exactly one thing.
It'll often say can't on it.
Yeah, Containment Priest, Graph Digger's Cage, those are some really strong examples. Whereas, Aven Mind Sensor, well, it's a hate piece. Definitely not Silver Bullet. Tutoring is something that every deck wants to do, so that's just a generically good card.
You sort of, when you get to a point where people are tutoring enough and have maybe tutor-based combos and combos that require tutoring to go to work, like it's a good card that then gets pushed into, well, I can now play this and play it profitably, right?
Yeah, so there's the Silver Bullet hate pieces that hate on win conditions, so yeah, Graph Cage. And then there's stuff that hates on, maybe win conditions as well as value engines. So it's almost like the reverse compost, where you're shutting off your opponent's value engines. So a great example is Rest in Peace and Gitrog Monster, where not only are you shutting off their ability to win the game, you're also shutting off their ability to draw cards. So they're just sacking lands for nothing. Notion
Or-
Thief is one where
yeah.
it's like it's not covering both categories, so it's not shutting off the Gitrog monster's ability to win, but it is only shutting off their ability to gain value from drawing cards. So there's some subtle definitions in terms of, hate pieces, whether or not you're targeting their win or their value engine, but they're generally falling under the same category.
I think this hasn't necessarily been mentioned, but it's kind of another category, and I apologize in advance, which is like tech decks, where like certain decks are kind of meant to tech against the metagame as
Like the
because
skateboards.
there's like just like the skateboards, just like the mini screwdrivers they give
Dude,
you.
oh my god, my tech deck's gonna grind all over this pod.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
What?
But yeah,
beta,
strategies
beta
that
duels?
like just
Do a
scratches
sick
all over
ollie.
the place.
Flip right into the middle of this table.
I made the joke, but there is
Yeah.
a point, which is like, certain strategies that don't fold to the like traditional interaction that is found in other decks. I think that technically counts as like a tech strategy.
Yeah, I'd say
Yeah.
so. I'm going like, say, playing a creature-based combo, like solely creature-based combo in a blue heavy meta, where it's less likely that they're going to be able to like have the counterspell for a creature. Say like Dockside Team or Sabretooth, right? Like it's a lot harder to counter a Dockside or a Team or Sabretooth than it is to counter an Ad Nauseam or a Flash, right?
Yeah, and then so carrying on in terms of categories in Silver Bullets, we were talking about with hating on particular strategies. Those were more permanent based effects, and I don't know if it's worth putting these in their own category but what about things like extirpate, where you're trying to shut down someone's Gitrog monster combo or their Shuffle Hole combo, before those decks
Throwback.
died and became casual. Yeah.
Yeah.
What is this, 2019?
Don't remind me.
So out of
Yeah.
God.
Yeah. So do you think cards like extirpate belong in their own category, or would they fall under this category that we previously defined?
Extirpate specifically probably falls under silver bullet for me.
Okay.
Yeah. I think there's a set of really strong
Yeah, it's definitely
one for ones
an
that are
anti-win
like
card.
well costed
Yes.
that kind of just count as good tech because of how well they're costed,
Think about
how
it.
hard they are to
Extirpate,
interrupt.
Extirpate lets you dunk on people's top deck tutors.
Yeah.
Get them.
I think like something that's probably more applicable to that kind of tech, where like not really permanent based, is like potentially something like Submerge, where you have like you get fairly high value out of it, and it can stop a lot of combos from 0 mana, which is not typically expected. If say they've already resolved a combo piece, but you sort of have to wait until feel like people are definitely playing enough forests and people are playing the creature based combos that it nabs, right?
And
So then
it's also not
what
like
category would you? What kind of category would you call that for that card?
It's sort of hard to define for me. I feel like it's sort of its own like interaction category. Like I think there's definitely like one shot
Niche good
interaction.
cards or
There's like
something
one
like
shot
that.
interaction that works a lot better into certain metas than it does into others, right?
Okay.
Like
Morgan, did you have
meltdown
something?
is one of those things as well, right?
Oh, Meltdown is a
Yeah.
great card. Yeah.
I was also thinking about like teching in extra sweeper effects, which is something that you might want to do in a deck like Kess. You have your 2 or 3 base sweepers, but then you could put in extras if you were, and like where it's only good if you're actually consistently seeing enough creatures that you want to see one or sometimes multiple sweepers in a game. And like the meta has to
There we
be
go.
pretty
So we
dense
got
for that.
it's strategy, silver bullet hate, and then there's removal based hate tech. That's good. There we go. It's working. It's all coming together now.
I mean, so and then the other one, I think the other one is also just stuff that you play to take advantage and like put just
Yeah,
solely
the proactive stuff,
solely
like
solely
compost.
proactive stuff, but even more so proactive than compost. Stuff like Reap specifically, where
Oh,
Reap doesn't
baby.
even
Yeah,
necessarily
Reap is
tax your
definitely-
opponents. I don't think like somebody having a Reap in their deck really ever affects your chances of casting a Timnir or Gitrog monster or like a
No,
Dark
'cause it's a
Confidant in
bad
your
card
hand.
and it never works.
But when it's turned on, it's this like hugely impactful proactive spell, right? That like just puts you like doesn't necessarily actually do anything to your opponents, but just like increases the power and sometimes consistency of your strategy more when you can correctly identify a place to play it, right?
Okay, as a slight aside, what's the most anyone here has ever seen anyone get off a Reap?
I've seen 3.
I've seen 3.
Okay. I don't think I've ever
don't think I've
seen
seen
three.
more than 2.
I've seen mostly 1 with the occasional 2.
So,
and the card just
okay.
seems so unimpressive.
We can get sidetracked here for a second, but I still personally feel like instant speed regrowth is like far and away playable enough to put in a lot of decks, like most decks.
I mean, the problem is
And it certainly counts as tech. Like, whether it's been seen as a tech card in any meta in any format is a different question.
Yeah, so I think that's a pretty good thing to put a bow on for categories of tech. And there's one last point under what makes good tech that who put this down?
Oh yeah, I can speak to that.
That's Matt. That's you. Okay.
Yeah, so this is kind of the category of like subtle / underestimated tech. And I have kind of a funny example, which is Winds of Rebuke. And like as Morgan kind of mentioned, like to stuff top deck tutors, and which also kind of just has a very good effect by itself and kind of could work into combos as well.
yeah, there's definitely some combos that bounce spells are really good against.
Yeah.
Like obviously, Scepter is like the ceiling of that. But even often Food Chain doesn't have the mana to recast Food Chain when they start going off. And just bouncing Food Chain is pretty good.
That's so tragic when they have just so much creature mana, just as much creature mana as you could ever want in the world, but nothing to cast a Fruit Chain with.
Or even like strategies that involve reanimation or like the reanimation enchantments.
Yeah. Well,
Assuming you don't instantly lose. Like it doesn't work super well against Razaketh,
specifically bouncing
but
the reanimation target, though, right?
yeah.
Okay, so we've decided that we know all the great cards we want to tech into our deck. We've got all these different categories. I mean, we haven't really justified which categories you should be putting in at any given time for a given meta. And honestly, I don't think there's a hard and fast set of rules to do this.
I think it really
This kind of
it
evaluation
just comes with like playtesting and experience, right? Like it's sort of just like Magic, and like it's always said that like sideboarding is one of the most difficult things to learn in constructed Magic, right?
Yeah.
It's just like
Yeah, but how about mainboarding and
like
Commander?
even if you just enter a tournament and somebody like already assembled your sideboard for you, it's already hard enough to know what factors go into like swapping cards out and like what cards you swap out, what cards you swap in, how many of the cards that you're swapping in you should be putting in, like how being on the play and draw affects that, all that kind of stuff. And then like that's not even talking about assembling the sideboard, which is basically like this is sort of like teching in cEDH is all of that rolled into one. So it's almost never, I don't think, an art that you can master, but it's just something that you can like put time into and like just get acquainted with as many cards as possible, right?
And like it's also one card in 100, which means the effect is often very subtle unless you're actively tutoring for the card all the time. It's really hard to evaluate actually how effective something was, because
I think if you're in a pinch, like if you really have to tech and you have a tech card in mind, just take out like your worst 1-for-1 effect. Because honestly,
that's pretty
like,
good advice. Yeah.
yeah, it's definitely a decent baseline.
But one thing,
Or
it'd be great if there was a resource or something with just a list of meta tech cards. I mean, lots of people have them in their
Forge.
primers, and they'll do this, but there's no like kind of compendium for if you're trying to hate on Hulk, these are all the Hulk hate pieces you should consider teching in, and going on for each different archetype or strategy. So unfortunately, such a resource doesn't exist, so we can't direct you to that. And this podcast is not a great medium for that kind of resource. So we'll just have to call it there and say, go read some primers, go on Scryfall, go look at lots of the meta decks, and infer what is appropriate, or go on dedicated deck servers and ask how to tech your deck for specific metas.
Oh my god, just go onto dedicated deck servers and ask what the spiciest tech that people are playing is, and just get bombarded with just garbage cards. And then test some of them out and see if they're actually playable.
A surprising resource for good tech is those like either low color or like tier 2 just zealot deck builders who kind of just have to put good tech cards in for their decks to win.
Yeah.
Like
that's true. Yeah.
So like honestly, like kind of just poking around the fringe like tier 2 area will actually reveal a lot of good tech.
Don't look at Sushi Hulk for this kind of thing. Sushi Hulk can just win even if the deck is,
hey man,
you mess up like 5 different card choices and run just like suboptimal choices. Deck's gonna win anyway. So go find someone who needs to really struggle to win to find that super spicy
and also
top secret tech.
And also finding someone who needs to struggle to find good cards to fill out their deck. Like that's
a big one actually. I basically cut my teeth on finding hot tech on trying to make Virals work, just because there's just not enough playable cards in black green for Hulk that you can make up 100. So you're forced to find like just cards that you would never in any other case ever play, but you sort of have to. By the way, my favorite of those, Sinister Concoction.
That's hot. I appreciated that when I was looking at Virals.
Yeah, I had that on Muldrotha for a bit.
But yes, so you found your tech because you bugged all the people in these deck servers, and you maybe found someone has gone and someone ambitious has gone and made this resource that doesn't exist yet. So you've got the tech cards that you want to put in your deck, but how do you decide what to take out? Who wants to start on this one?
So I mean, the first thing you can look at is, are there sort of more tech choices in the deck already that you might want to take out? Like, are you running
swap techs?
Yeah, so that's one thing you can do, is you can just swap, your artifact hate piece. You're going, oh, there's a collector roof in this deck, but I pretty much never see any deck that's really relying on artifacts, so maybe I'll swap that out for whatever it is I want to put in. So that's like one of the first things you could look at. But then assuming you don't have that, because that's somewhat more obvious, then you start looking at, think about your different card categories and which cards in those categories are stronger and weaker, and, how important it is to maintain the density on those categories. So, Matt said your worst 1-for-1 cards, that could be a counterspell or removal. It could also be your weakest acceleration card, like maybe the weakest dork in your deck. Avacyn's Pilgrim can probably go from a lot of decks if you really need the slot.
If I could get Arbor Elf out of there, just
I'm so close to taking out Avacyn's Pilgrim, man.
Oriole Druid.
One thing I also want to mention about Morgan's point regarding Null Rod and stuff is that often you can't have a deck that's over teched, because if you're like, oh, what if I run into this artifact meta? I'm going to put in Collector Roof and Null Rod. Oh, but what if I'm also running into graveyards? I'm going to put Rest in Peace and all this stuff. And your deck becomes bloated with cards that are not going to be good in a particular matchup or meta. So you really do want to focus on the meta that you're expecting or that you are seeing, and try to tech for that meta so that you don't, undermine your own core game plan. Yeah, that's just my little 2 cents there.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go for it.
So the one other thing I wanted to say was, I was talking about card categories, and I mentioned Avacyn's Pilgrim. It is important to understand the deck that you have when you make these decisions. as an example, one of the things I see a ton of people say is, "Oh, just cut the weak dorks from food chain," and like in a deck like food chain, the dorks are absolutely critical, and you certainly shouldn't be cutting them. Which may not be true of something like Flash Hulk, like Thracia's Tomb to Flash Hulk, where like the dorks are obviously good, but having them in play isn't like a requirement for you winning, or doesn't make it substantially easier for you to win in the way that it does in something like Food Chain. So just be careful that you're not taking sort of generalized advice and applying it to a specific case where it may not actually be appropriate.
Yeah, it's sort of to continue the analogy for 1v1 formats even further. It's just you have to be careful continuously not to over sideboard, which is a huge issue. It's just like once you start interrupting your own engine, you're probably going too far on teching, right? Like you just, basically reiterating what everybody else has said. But again, like
when I started playing Modern, I'd sideboard in like 8 cards every game.
This is consistent, like across pretty much every constructed format. Like you don't put in too many hate cards at a time because you need to keep the core of your deck functional and intact. So you just have to keep that in mind when you're teching and altering decks, right?
Yeah, and so these we gave some solid advice, Avacyn's Pilgrim, or like your worst acceleration piece, your worst 1-for-1 piece of removal for finding like a quick and dirty slot to test tech, but finding a long-term spot for these kinds of things it's not always a quick and dirty rule like that, right? So it's not going to be that your Avacyn's Pilgrim or your Nature's Claim is the go-to flex slot to remove every time. Sometimes it's appropriate, like as we were talking about much earlier in the episode, about cards that were bad against burn if you're playing Jund. There are certain cards that are going to be worse into the particular meta that you're trying to tech against. So you might want to reevaluate your assumptions on what is a staple in your deck and consider those for removal instead of some of these, following the rules that we put forth.
Yeah, and to be clear, this is like if you go around touting that you're cutting staples and deck discords, this is probably going to get you into hot water. but in general, you're gonna like when you have to make cuts for meta tech and new cards in general, just anything that you need to fit into a deck. Make sure to dedicate some amount of time to checking that the cards that you take for granted as these are always in this deck are actually still cards that should always be in the deck.
Do you have any good examples?
I think for my personal experience, I had this is when Shuffle still existed, RIP, all that stuff. When I was trying to make space in Shuffle for both tournament teching, I would tend with Shuffle to tech into like anti-stacks and more like mass removal for tournaments, personally, because I would expect, just like random stack decks. So like trying to fit in a Psych Rift and a Force of Vigor and a like Natural State into a very tight list already was sort of difficult. And some of the times I would actually over time start flexing out slots that were considered to be core, but it actually like would work out fairly well. So the like base example is like flexing out a Summoner's Pact in a Flash Hulk deck, which like sort of sounds insane, right? Because it's just the second copy of Hulk. But it was something that like it's something that like at the time I just took for granted as this is just part of the 98 that doesn't get taken out ever. This is just like, it's just too good. There's no reason I would ever cut this card. But when it came to making slots, I realized that it was actually something that was removable and didn't fully mess with my like game plan that much. And that like for like short stints, it was feasible to strip out this combo piece for more interaction, right? So just like stuff like that.
Yeah, you can also just take out cards that are it fills similar slots or fill similar purposes.
Yes,
I
that's
should
a big
stop
one.
using terminology that's confusing. So Compost is going to be a really strong corrective draw engine in the right meta. So if you are in that meta, you can maybe take out your worst draw engine, maybe take out a Dark Confidant or an Okame adversary, or whatever the appropriate worst slot for card advantages in your deck. Because typically you don't want to throw off the ratio of acceleration, card advantage, core engine. Most of the time those are pretty refined in decks, and you don't want to mess with those ratios too much, but
I
staying
think
in slot allows you to
I think people definitely
avoid that problem.
They put an overemphasis on that. Like yes, ideally, the ratios work the way the deck is, but you see it all the time, particularly with budget versions. It's like, oh well, I can't afford an Imperial Seal, so I'm going to play Diabolic Tutor. It's like, well, okay, let's obviously that's an extreme example, but
and that's also
you
just
should
really
make sure
hard to
you're not cutting. Maybe you cut the third worst card in the deck to sort of maintain ratios, but you shouldn't be cutting the 23rd worst card in the deck because you're putting in a draw engine and it's a draw engine.
Yeah, for sure. But it's really hard to give a solid rule of thumb or solid procedure for arriving at those kinds of cuts. A lot of the time, it's based on experience and having the correct feeling about cards.
Yeah, but just don't cut a great card or like a good card or a card that performs well to maintain ratios is what I mean.
Yeah, just if you want more of this effect, then it can just be more of that effect. Like sort of similar example as well. Like regrowth for Reap. If you're already on regrowth and Reap is playable in your meta, that can just be a direct swap.
Yeah. So we've got one last thing to talk about on this in this topic, and that's going to be when should you just switch decks?
Yes,
because we talked about over teching, and if you're, I guess it's sort of a form of over teching where you're trying to combat a specific meta because it's just a bad matchup for you or whatever, and you have to put in so much hate and tech to try and address what's going on that it just dilutes your deck into a garbage pile.
Yeah, I think another good example is like if your deck kind of just folds to too much of like the common tech, then you can't really tech against tech, and you kind of get into that loop, and that's I think a good point to switch.
Yeah, if you're like your meta is teching against you, like it.
Yeah. Like if you lose to both Curse Totem and Null Rod, maybe.
Yeah, there's kind of. In the cards we've been discussing, there's sort of two broad categories, which is like bad into and good against, that aren't necessarily the same thing. And like when your deck is, when you put in a tech card that's good against something, like that might be a Grafdigger's Cage. Whereas you might take out something like Rule of Law that's bad into Flash. And when your deck is just kind of bad into the stacks you're facing, that might be a good time to look at switching.
When you're looking at a deck and just being like, well, I need to strip out the cards that are bad against what people are playing against me, and that list of cards is like 20 cards. Like it's probably like time to just rethink the strategy as a whole.
Yeah, you also just don't want to water down your core strategy too much, because your core strategy is what's keeping you afloat compared to like the generic meta. So if you're taking your Gitrog monster deck and you're being like, man, Sushi Hulk is a menace, I should really run all these different cards to tech against it, which maybe Gitrog monster is a bad example because there's not a lot you can do to tech against Sushi. Yeah, because you can maybe attack one axis, but then you lose to the other. So Sushi in a way is like facing, two decks. So if you're watering down your core strategy, you're going to end up in a worse position against something like the generic console decks. If you're running Leyline of the Void, Grafdigger's Cage, et cetera, et cetera. So you don't want to fall into that trap. But there's almost kind of a strange way to look at it in terms of if you're kind of lost in terms of being able to tech against a deck effectively or meta. Sometimes no tech is appropriate. Sometimes just optimizing your deck for linear speed, which I think Gitrog right now, it's not great into the Sushi Hulk meta. So, we've joked on the Gitrog server about calling it just a casual deck now. But I don't know if it's correct to run Grafdigger's Cage because Consult is just so pervasive and you can be slowing yourself down. And it might just be correct to try and race.
And it's sort of connected to what I was going to, or sort of what I touched on earlier about like teching into cards that give you an advantage, and like advance your own game plan rather than take away from the rest tables game plans, where sometimes it's not even necessarily like even as obvious as I'm playing this card that says for each black permanent or whenever a black card or whenever a green spell, like not even like playing cards like that, but more playing cards that like, hey, I probably need to be faster in this meta, so I'm going to play like some of the worst tutors that I wouldn't be running normally. I'm going to pick up a couple more rituals that wouldn't normally be in this deck. If I'm not already on like an ad nauseum in this deck, like maybe I just fit in an ad nauseum into this deck to try to take advantage of that, right? Like not even like linearly targeting like a specific attribute of the decks that you're playing against, but more targeting a weakness can also be an option.
Yeah, like teching so that you're not so that you have cards that are good against them, but just so that your overall strategy is more effective against whatever it is that they're doing.
Yeah, basically.
Okay, so does anyone have anything else to say about tech choices? Because I feel like we've covered it pretty good. Otherwise, we can move on.
I mean, I we've mentioned this before, but just I want to reiterate that one of the best ways to figure out how to tech is to talk to people, be that on Reddit, Discord, wherever it is you interact with people who play the deck that you play. And some people will call you an idiot, and that's fine. Don't be discouraged. And one of the other things is make sure you, like, if you ask specific questions, you can often get an answer. Whereas if you ask a more general question, you might not. So, if you ask, what card should I play to deal with whatever it is you're facing, versus, like, how should I tech my deck? Or, what card should I swap for this card? Versus something more general. You might get better answers. Or if you just say, I'm cutting this card, what should I put in its place? Then you might get a better answer than if you just sort of ask something vague or broad.
Also, sort of extending on like asking people, just quickly, asking people that play the decks that you're taking against can also be a great resource. I know, like, just like I think I've done this a couple of times, but just if you're not sure like how to target another deck, just going into like if you're having like problems with like a Kess deck, just like go into like the Grixis Discord and just be like, hey, like I'm in these color combinations, or I'm on this commander. Like, what can I do to make your life hell? And I mean, people will actually respond to that stuff.
Yeah, sometimes you can get people might get misguided in terms of thinking that Ashes of the Abhorrent is going to hate on this Hulk deck, but if you go and ask the Hulk server, hey, I'm thinking of running Ashes of the Abhorrent in my whatever deck. What do you think about that? They're gonna say, that's not gonna do anything to us, so go for it.
It sounds like a great idea.
Yeah, so it's a great way to check to make sure you aren't going down any unproductive routes. But yes, so that wraps it up for our core topic. And before we move on to gut check and listener questions, we decided it'd be fun to each pick a piece of tech that is maybe under the radar or something that we've been holding on to or unsure about, and just throw it out there because maybe people might be interested or unaware of it. So, Reed, do you wanna start off on this one?
Sure, I'll start us off on this one. So this is one that I've had in the back of my mind for like a bit now, probably like a bit over a month, I'd say, something like that. And it's a piece of tech that I feel like Xur should probably be interested in. And to the best of my knowledge, I don't think any Xur pilots have picked up on it. And the card that I'm talking about is called Metamorphic Alteration.
I have not heard of this card. And I play Xur, so let's hear.
Metamorphic Alteration is a card from M19, so fairly recent. It is a blue enchantment for 1 and a blue, enchantment aura. Enchant creature. As Metamorphic Alteration enters the battlefield, choose a creature. Enchanted creature is a copy of the chosen creature. So I just feel like it's okay. Here are the two main applications that I think that this card can have. Okay, I think being able to fetch this off of Xur to enchant an opposing commander and like turn it into a mana dork is a pretty big deal. Because it basically turns it like into a removal spell that like they either like have to like ram their commander into somebody else's blocker depending on what you turn it into, depending on what you turn it into, or have to have like a removal spell for this. And it's like it's sort of like
Darksteel mutation.
Yeah, it's sort of like a Darksteel mutation, which like is not great on its own, but also has the application that you can like potentially like use it to like once you're down on enchantments and you don't really have much to fetch out or just like any of the above, like you can swing, get this out, and then like turn Xur into like a Gitrog monster or like turn Xur into like a Kess. Or like you can turn like a Dark Confidant that you control into like a Thrasios or a Tymna or something like that. And it's sort of like an on-demand P image that you can fetch with your commander.
Turn the Forbidden Orchard spirit you got into
exactly
value.
Not sure if I'm completely sold on it, but it's definitely spicy and worth considering.
That's definitely hot tech for sure.
And I feel like that's going to be the trend with all of these techs because it's where we tried to pick ones that were out there and not super obvious. So it's probably going to be a sentiment that's echoed. Yeah. Matt, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I'll go next. I think mine kind of triple checks off the box subtle / underestimated, and that's Tail's End. This card was talked about a lot with when Jace was printed, but I think kind of fell under the radar, and because I don't think it was actually very strong at that point. But now that Labman is gone and it's just Oracle, Hulk, and Jace, I think Tail's End checks all the boxes for me and is generically and can be used outside of just being a tech choice.
The floor
because it does counter really strong. Yeah, really strong commander counterspell.
Yeah, and I mean countering creatures is no joke, so definitely interesting. I'll go with mine, and this one is like I don't know. I'm not. This one I'm considering for my Anafenza deck, so not the don't have the most options available to me in Abzan. So one thing I've found out from just playtesting the deck is that silence effects are pretty good when you don't have counter magic. So Ranger Captain of Eos is something that you can use to tutor Caustic Caterpillar to destroy stuff or find dorks, etc. But it's also very strong for sacrificing itself to stop your opponents on the turn you're trying to combo. I mean, also you can sack it to interfere with combos, but
That card in Heliod, though? Wow.
It's a lot better when it finds Shrieking Drake.
it's a hot card. But yeah, that's not my tech. That's not my tech choice.
Okay, yeah.
I just wanted to talk about how silence effects are something that have grown on me. Now, in my search for more silence effects, I've looked at Abeyance, and that one's been interesting, but that's only target opponent. It does cantrip though.
Wait,
but,
can I try to call it? Okay, no,
I mean, I'm giving it away. It's
Go
basically
for it.
given
All
away
right,
at this
go for
point.
it.
Okay, so for 1 and a white, the tech choice that I'm proposing is Mandate of Peace. Is someone click on the keyboard to look this up?
You can only cast during combat.
Yes.
Yeah.
Except it has another line of text that's not just silence, and you can only cast it during combat. Go on.
It ends the combat phase. So it is a fog. But yeah, most importantly is that you can use this during your combat to, get a silence effect and then try and combo. Yeah, I'm gonna test it. We'll see how it goes.
What, you
fact
didn't
that
even
you can't-
mention the best part about it, though.
Denying Tim the
and
draws.
denying Zerg.
Well, you didn't even talk about the second best part. If they go to combat to cast their necromancy, boom,
Just get them.
get them.
I mean,
yeah.
I think that is the big weakness with this card, which is that often people don't go to combat.
Before they attempt to win, that is. Yes.
Okay, Morgan. All right, no need to. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, it's not gonna. It's hard. I don't think they're gonna be printing another silence. For one mana.
But
That
what you
same
can
effect
do
again. So
is if they
you take what you take what you
if
can
they
get.
hit you with a grob, you let them hit you with a grob, and then they cast a tutor in response, and then you cast a mandator piece and exile the ability and the tutor.
Yeah, I mean, just Imperial Seal. Going to combat, attacking with your Timna is not too bad. And I suppose, if you're really desperate.
So what you're saying is you should cast your
Mandate of
tutors
Peace.
before attacks to play around Mandate of Peace. Got it. None of this tutor
Okay,
in response to the draw trigger.
Fun fact: Mandate of Peace has a 5 out of 5 community rating on Gatherer.
Oh yeah? How many votes
Yeah.
does it have?
0.
Is that because they
the
disabled
card
the voting
says
system
exile.
like 4 years ago?
Oh, I didn't even realize. Okay, so Morgan, you're up last.
My last
What do you
card,
got for
it's
us?
definitely seen some discussion, because, it's just seen, it attacks it's very obvious what it does and why people would want to play it, and it's Insight, which is an enchantment for 2 and a blue that reads, whenever an
Yeah.
opponent casts a green spell, draw a card. And if you look at a lot of the top end of competitive EDH decks, there's a fair number of green spells in them. The reason I think it hasn't seen sort of the mass adoption that you might initially expect is that it's 3 mana, and often those green spells are cast on turn 1 and 2, and then not so much later. So what I'm looking at adding it to Inala, which is a deck that actually wipes the board of dorks pretty regularly, which means that it creates an incentive for people to play more dorks after. But also talking about dorks, the other thing is that green spells in decks are often not actually that critical. So it's easier than, compared to Compost, it's much easier to decide not to cast green spells than black spells, as an example.
Yeah.
Right on.
But there is just
Okay.
a ton of stuff that it hits.
So, getting close to the close of the episode, we've got everyone's favorite segment, Gut Check.
God.
Gut check.
Okay, so keeping in theme with how often we've brought up Modern and other 60-card formats, my gut check question for you guys is, what is your favorite 60-card format?
Kamigawa block Pauper Tiny Leader stuff. Oh no, that's a 50 card format, right?
I have no clue.
Yeah, yes, it's a 50 card format because you can't make 100 card decks in that format.
Were Tiny Leaders decks not just 50 cards? Anyways,
I don't know,
I don't
man.
know.
I never
They
played
might
that.
have
but
been, actually,
I know for a fact that there is not a Kamigawa block Pauper Tiny Leaders deck that you can put 100 cards into. There just isn't
yeah,
enough cards
it's
in
50.
the block.
It's a 50 card format.
Okay, so does anyone have their? You guys have your answers? I feel
Yeah.
like this is
Yeah.
a pretty quick one. So
Yeah, I can go.
Matt,
Pioneer.
you're first. Pioneer. Okay, right on. Respectable. Morgan.
I'm gonna actually say Frontier, and I know it's dead, but
No, Mike.
no, like I think that
It just
it was
had
actually
to be a hipster.
No, I think it was actually a little bit more interesting. Just like I mean, at the time that it was sort of proposed, there wasn't quite as much stuff. Like it was 2 or 3 years ago, so a lot of the most powerful decks that have existed or been banned out of Pioneer actually weren't possible. And then you didn't have the
Wasn't that format just all like siege rhinos?
well, you didn't.
Like just
the thing is, you
3-color
didn't
plus good
have
stuff?
Shocklands, so that definitely created like a different restriction on deck building. Yeah, and like
Interesting.
I remember looking at it at the time, and there was like a reasonably diverse metagame, a bunch of different strategies. There were combos, there was aggro, there was control. Obviously, it didn't get far enough to see what it where it would shake out when it was being refined, and maybe that's why I liked it. But like maybe it's just settled
Reed.
formats. Are
At one point, it was Pauper.
Oh, that's what I was
Because-
expecting.
Oh,
Okay.
really? It's not Pauper anymore?
I can't play Skred, Mystic Sanctuary, and Ephemerate in the same deck anymore. So
Aw,
my life got a
Muffin.
whole lot harder.
I can see why things got.
Which I understand why I'm not allowed to do that anymore, but I'm sad that I can't.
Are you?
What? Yeah.
You really sad that Astrolabe is gone?
Yes. I mean, it needed to go,
Really?
but I loved that deck because it was so much fun to play and just crush with. That being said, probably my current favorite format is like my default, which is Legacy. I don't really get to play Legacy
Okay.
much, but like Legacy is just like objectively a pretty great format. And I'm just like,
I think
just like it a
Legacy is
lot.
probably one of the most fun formats to
Yeah.
watch.
It is a great spectator
Morgan,
format.
you're being serious when you're Frontier. You weren't just trying to have it so that we all say different answers, right?
No, like I genuinely.
Okay,
really-
because we're now going to end it up where everyone has a different answer.
You're
Because my
actually
favorite
gonna say
60 card
modern?
format is modern. Yeah, I like
Yeah.
modern.
I
Okay.
like-
Wow.
Wow, that actually blows my mind because, like, I actually hate
Yeah,
modern.
it is not a great format right now.
I really don't like modern.
I like modern the way I remember it from. There was a point where it was good, right?
At one point, it was healthy. I
Like,
can't
yeah,
remember when,
historically
but
speaking-
I remember it was.
Well, I just bought into Amulet Titan, and that deck appeals to me a lot.
Yeah, Lyndon-
so
Lyndon-
that's
that
why.
deck is a
Lyndon
cool
just bought
deck,
into Amulet Titan, and he refuses to believe that Titan will ever get banned.
Shut your mouth. Shut your mouth. It's gonna be around forever and ever and ever. But I mean, yeah, like my first modern deck was Fecundity Goblins.
Oh,
So
good old Dirty Kitty.
The Dirty
yeah.
Kitty Legacy deck. Yeah. Deck was sick. And then my next modern deck was Neobrand. That I stopped playing that deck because it was just not a lot of fun for your opponents at the LGS when you're just sitting there and gold fishing and games are over in like 2 seconds. So nice to have a solid top tier deck that's also a bit more interactive and actually playing Magic. So yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. And before we close out the show, we have listener questions, and these are going to be real quick. So Timothy87 asks, what are y'all's favorite sleeves, deck boxes, etc.?
So I feel like we probably all have the same sleeve answer, right? I don't know.
Katanas?
Really?
I'm on katanas. Yeah.
Dragon Shield mats.
I think
dude,
Dragon Shield
with
mats are just
perfect
like the
cards.
best overall, unfortunately. I want to love katanas, but like they're just like a bit too small. And then like
Oh, I think the fact that they're small makes it so that they don't get that crinkle over time at the top.
I don't think nothing beats the variety in color personalization
Yeah.
that you can do with Dragon Shields.
That's a shame. Yeah, that I'm missing on that. So I have to have lots of
And
overlapping
they
colors.
consistently release new and they try new things. Like I think Dragon Shield just kills it. And
Okay, do
Yeah.
inner sleeves matter? I think we're
Man,
all
it's-
yeah,
like
perfect cards.
It's
Perfect
great.
cards.
Oh,
I have
perfect.
so many
No,
options
no,
with
no.
Dragon Shields, which is why the last like 30 packs of sleeves I've bought have been matte red.
nice.
Okay, well, getting the same sleeve
I-
color does
so-
make a lot of sense.
So I agree that perfect hards are the best, but I'm currently working through my backlog of KMC just perfect fits that aren't perfect hards because
Yeah, I'm just a fan of the perfect
well,
fits, not
it's,
the perfect
it's mostly
cards.
because I have like half a case of them sitting around
Damn.
because I went in
I'm
on
gonna be honest, I have no idea how many sleeves that is. Could not tell.
oh like 5 packs like of the inners.
That's not
so-
bad.
Give me some. Give me some. I'm out of
Nope,
inner
I need
sleeves.
them. I'm actually at the point where I'm using inners as my trade sleeves now because I ran out of Ultra Pros and I don't want to buy more.
I do
Yeah, the
actually,
one
I do
downside of
actually like
perfect cards-
the Dragon Shield smokes, as long as you don't have white bordered cards in your deck, because then they look terrible.
Yeah, and
They
then
just
deck
look like dirty.
boxes. What do you guys
the-
That's what I was
deck
gonna
boxes?
say. Like with perfect cards, you have to throw all your deck boxes out because none of your decks fit into them anymore.
I think my favorite deck box is a combination of the World of Warcraft trading card game deck box that I have, which then goes inside of a cardboard box, which houses my
Okay,
deck.
I've got the realist deck box kit, going around. So it's I use
okay.
boulders.
Sure.
I use Ultra Pro boulders, and then I stick them inside of the archives, and that is peak deck
Inside of
box
the
right
what?
there. The archives.
Oh, okay.
Those like
the
they're meant to
Ultimate
fit
Card archives,
400 card boulders or 5 60 cards.
I have to admit, I do have a soft spot for the classic 800 count BCW box.
Dude,
But I'm currently
I love-
I'm just on archives, no inner deck box.
Okay, but the real answer for sleeves is it's the fully sealable sleeves inside of a regular, let's say Dragon Shield, and then that is inside of the clear outer triple sleeve, and then that's all of inside of a top loader, and then those are all of inside another deck box, which is inside of another deck box, which is inside of a safe.
I actually just laminate
See, the
my
one
cards.
downfall about that
Yeah.
though is yeah. Seal them forever.
I personally like to
Yeah,
send my
me-
decks in to get graded and then just play them.
Okay, and then our second question, and this is our last one. This comes from Kixar. What is your favorite card art?
So I'm looking at this right now, and Lyndon has like 6. So I'm gonna ask him to narrow it down to 1.
I'm gonna narrow
Oh,
it down
dude.
to 4 because
Can I do 3?
actually no,
Really
I can
good.
do this down to 3. So my 3 are, one of them is 3 because they're all like a series
Oh
of
my
old
God.
lands from
So
like,
you're not narrowing
So
it
you're
down
not
at all.
narrowing it
Okay,
down. No,
got it.
you just do those 3.
if you look at homelands or look at Ice Age, a lot of those lands that aren't playable have really nice arts. So like Timberline Gorge, Ace and Abbey, and things like that. Beautiful arts, not playable. I
Good
also
talk.
really like
All right,
the
Reed's turn.
the food chain promo, the one with the tiger and the Dark Depths box topper from UMA. Those are my favorite arts.
I think my favorite, and is pretty consistently has been my favorite since it was released, is Invocation Days. It is a very, very pretty card. Hate the border, but the art is fantastic. And I think like the art actually like won awards the year that it was released. So objectively
Yeah,
correct.
that does not surprise me. They did a playmat I think
Yep.
for that
Yes,
one.
they
And it was
did.
really cool. Yeah. Too bad everything surrounding it is a mess.
Morgan?
So
What's yours?
my favorite art is Theros Forest 248 by Adam Paquette. And if you want it to not be literally just a basic land, I'd have to go with the classic answer of Gift Vorzhova with the stained glass wings.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it's not that one.
So I'm actually a lot, more refined than these heathens. I judge a card by its art, its frame, its border, its set symbol. Anyways, I think the Tempest Counterspell has been historically my favorite looking card, simply because I like blue cards that have red art, like Force of Will. But yeah, Tempest Counterspell, and then my runner-up, I think, is Reaping the Rewards. It's kind of like, it's just like a 4-color card to me. Like, it's red, it's blue, it's green. It's awesome.
Dude, the Tempest Counterspell looks like the Emperor from Star Wars going.
Yeah. It does have that.
shooting the lightning out of his fingers. It's fun.
Looks like
It's
one of
also
those,
my
like-
favorite version of Counterspell.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Very cool.
that's it for listener questions, and that brings us to the end of our show. If you guys would like to reach out to us with any questions, comments, or concerns, you can contact us on Twitter at Into the North Pod, via our email intothenorthpodcast@gmail.com, or on our Discord server, the invite link for which can be found in the description for this episode. An extra special thanks to all of our patrons who help cover the expenses for our show and allow us to work towards improving the quality of the podcast. If you too would like to become a patron, we are at patreon.com/Into the North Podcast. Thank you as always to the band Vox Cadre for our lovely podcast music, to Nate Slover for our equally lovely podcast logo, and to our long-suffering podcast editor Roadkill. Next episode will be out in 2 weeks. Until then, see ya.
Bye.
Peace.
Have a good one.